Meet James. He's farmed the same 500 acres his grandfather farmed, his father farmed, and he thought his children would farm. But in 6 months, everything changed. A new tax law, a price collapse, and mounting debts mean his family's 3 generations of farming are about to end. And James isn't alone. Thousands of British farmers are facing the exact same impossible choice: sell the land or lose everything. This is the story of how Britain is about to lose its farming industry in just 2 generations. What's happening isn't a cyclical downturn. It's the systematic collapse of an industry sustained for centuries. The pieces are falling into place with devastating precision. Let's start with James's story. James inherited the farm when his father passed away 15 years ago. The land had been in the family since the 1800s. It was worth everything because it was their legacy and livelihood. They grew cereal crops, kept livestock, and worked as a cohesive unit. The work was hard, margins tight, but sustainable. That was the deal. You worked the land and passed it on to your children. Then in October 2024, everything changed. The Labour government, in their autumn budget, announced a seismic shift in agricultural tax policy. They decided to remove the inheritance tax exemption for farms valued at more than £1 million. This exemption had been in place since 1992, created specifically to protect food security and ensure family farms could pass between generations without triggering a catastrophic tax bill. The government called it a revenue-raising measure. Farmers called it an existential threat. The specifics of the new policy are devastating in their simplicity. From April 2026, farms worth more than £1 million will be subject to 20% inheritance tax when the owner dies and the property passes to the next generation. While there are some conditional allowances that could push the threshold as high as £3 million, the core issue remains the same. For James, the math is straightforward and brutal. His farm is valued at approximately £1.2 million. That land, the machinery, the buildings, all of it is extremely valuable on paper. But it generates almost no profit. This is the central contradiction that the government fundamentally misunderstands. A farm can be worth a lot of money on the property market and still be desperately unprofitable. James explained it perfectly to a reporter. He said, "We're not tax dodgers. If we were making profits, tax our profits. But if we're not making profits, we can't pay inheritance tax. We do have these huge land resources that have a value on paper, but in reality, when you're farming, it doesn't mean anything." That statement encapsulates the crisis facing 30,000 to 70,000 family farms across Britain. The government's own data suggests that only 520 estates will be affected each year. But the National Farmers Union and the Countryland and Business Association estimate that up to 70,000 farms could be severely impacted. This isn't a disagreement over minor figures. This is the difference between affecting a wealthy elite and devastating the working heart of British agriculture. Most family farms are asset-rich but cash-poor. They own valuable land, but operate on razor-thin profit margins. When a farmer dies, his children face a choice. They can sell a chunk of the farm to pay the tax bill and hope they can keep operating on the remaining land. Or they can sell the entire operation and walk away. Justin Rogers, head of Farmers to Action, was blunt about what this means. He said, "If we don't do something this time, British agriculture will be over, and it'll be over in 2 generations, and that's maximum. If a third of most people's farms are taken away through taxation, they will be unable to sustain operations for the next generation." This isn't hyperbole. This is the cold calculation of a man who understands the economics of farming. The current generation of farmers was meant to be the bridge between the old way of farming and the new one. Instead, they're going to be the last generation of independent British farmers. But the inheritance tax is just one part of a much larger catastrophe. The real crisis is already here, and it's happening right now. For the past 18 months, British farmers have been caught in an economic vice. Input costs are rising, while output prices are collapsing. The margins that allowed farms to survive are disappearing, and the government isn't just introducing new taxes. They're simultaneously cutting support programs that have kept farms afloat during tough times. Let's talk about the numbers, because the numbers tell the story clearly. Throughout 2025, UK arable farmers struggled with consistently low grain prices. Spot feed wheat prices, which had been relatively stable, dipped to their lowest levels of the year in May. The moving averages drifted downwards into autumn, and farmers faced a bleak picture. But here's what really stings. Since November 2023, milling wheat prices in the Midlands and Wales have fallen by 28%. Meanwhile, the price of a loaf of white bread rose by 4.4%. The farmer gets less, the consumer pays more. The difference goes to processors, distributors, and retailers. The farmer is squeezed from both directions. Livestock farmers are in an even worse situation. Milk prices are now approximately 25% lower than they were just a year ago. Pig prices have fallen by 12%. Beef prices are around 10% lower, and although these prices were at near record levels in 2025, the trajectory is unmistakably downward. For a dairy farmer, a 25% drop in milk prices represents a catastrophic loss of income. A farm that was operating on 3% margins is now operating at a loss. They're not earning less profit. They're losing money every single day they continue to operate. The problem is the structure of the market. Farmers are small-scale businesses selling perishable products into markets where supermarkets and processors have consolidated power. When milk prices fall, the supermarkets push the price down. Farmers have no alternative. They can't store milk or wait for recovery. They have to sell today at whatever price is offered. And while prices are falling, costs are exploding. The Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts that input costs, ranging from machinery to fuel to fertilizer to insurance, will be 30% higher in 2026 than they were at the start of the decade. Agricultural input inflation, known in the industry as agflation, hit 8.4% in May 2026. Meanwhile, output prices have actually fallen by 5.8% year on year. This is the economic squeeze. Farmers are paying more for everything they buy while receiving less for everything they sell. Global fertilizer shortages will also begin impacting UK farmers in the latter half of 2026. What makes this situation particularly difficult is that there's no compensating uplift in output prices. In 2022, when input costs spiked, prices for agricultural products spiked too. Farmers could survive by passing the cost increases along. This time is different. Input costs are rising, output prices are falling, and farmers are caught in the middle with nowhere to go. The scale of the profitability crisis is staggering. UK farming's total income for 2025 is expected to fall to approximately £7.1 billion. This is a 7% decline from 2024. The projection for 2026 is even worse, with a further 8% decline expected. But these are just averages. The reality is far more severe in many regions and for many farm types. According to the most recent government data, just under half of all farms in Great Britain are failing to recover their costs in 2024 to 2025. This isn't theoretical. This means that nearly 50% of British farms are running at a loss. The Andersons Centre Models farms using a representative agricultural business called Loam Farm. In 2025, this farm showed a negative margin from production, despite receiving more than £120 per hectare in agri-environment support. Without that government support, the farm would have run a deficit. In 2026, the model shows a small positive margin only assuming a return to normal yields and continued substantial government support. But here's the problem. After 2026, the availability of government support through the Sustainable Farming Initiative is unknown. The government cut off the scheme without warning in 2025, leaving farmers scrambling to understand what support they could expect. Let's go back to James for a moment. He's trying to calculate what his farm will be worth in 5 years. He can't. He doesn't know what government support he'll receive. He doesn't know what milk prices or grain prices will be. He knows input costs will be higher. He knows his profit margins will be tighter. And he knows that in April 2026, his daughter will inherit a farm that looks extremely valuable on paper, but generates almost no cash. If he dies tomorrow, she faces an immediate tax bill of approximately £80,000. Where does she get that money? She either sells land, sells equipment, or walks away from the entire inheritance. This situation is playing out across the country. The National Farmers Union, representing 60,000 farmers, has organized sustained protests. The Country Land and Business Association has joined forces with them. Even Jeremy Clarkson, the television personality and controversial farmer, headed a march on November 19, 2024, drawing thousands of farmers to London. They came in tractors, in vehicles, with banners and flags. They were polite but firm. This is an existential threat to their industry. The government's response has been dismissive. They point to their own data, suggesting only 520 estates will be affected annually. They argue that these are wealthy landowners protecting their assets. They claim the inheritance tax change is necessary to raise revenue for public services. What they fundamentally fail to understand is that a farmer losing their family farm isn't a wealthy landowner protecting assets. It's the end of a multi-generational legacy. It's the loss of skills and knowledge accumulated over centuries. It's the destruction of a way of life. But even if the government suddenly reversed the inheritance tax changes tomorrow, it wouldn't solve the core crisis. British farming is facing a profitability catastrophe that makes inheritance tax irrelevant. A farm that can't generate profit is a farm that can't survive. The inheritance tax accelerates the timeline of collapse, but it doesn't create the collapse. The collapse is already happening. Consider what this means for farm succession. Historically, farm succession followed a pattern. An older farmer would work alongside his son or daughter for years. They would gradually share responsibility, with the older farmer stepping back incrementally while the younger farmer took over. This worked because the older farmer could help during the transition, and the farm could provide income for both. Now that pattern is breaking down. A farm that's running at a loss can't support 2 families. A young person looking at a farm that loses money every year might reasonably ask, why would I do this? Why would I inherit this liability? This generational break has profound implications. Farming requires skills passed through practical experience, not videos or courses. They come from working alongside experienced farmers. When young people decide not to farm, centuries of knowledge is lost. The government is simultaneously pushing farming in a direction that makes this knowledge loss even more likely. Environment. Secretary Steve Reed unveiled a blueprint for land use change in 2025 designed to balance housing development, nature restoration, and carbon targets. The consequence of these plans is stark. Farmland in England will be reduced by more than 10% by 2050. Less meat will be produced domestically. More land will be converted to housing, to solar panels, to wind turbines, to nature reserves. The government targets for these various objectives may result in the loss of up to 25% of currently farmed land over the next 25 years, including areas of high-quality arable land. An independent review by Baroness Minette Batters, the former NFU president and current farmer, found that domestic food production in the UK could decline by up to 32% by 2050 or 39% per capita. If current trends continue and no changes are made, the implications are extraordinary. The UK has pursued a relatively relaxed approach to food security since the financial crash in 2029. The assumption has been that in a globalized world, you can always buy food on the international market. That assumption is increasingly questionable. Supply chain disruptions have become more frequent. Geopolitical tensions are rising. Climate change is making agricultural production less predictable globally. A nation that depends entirely on imports for a third of its food is a nation that's vulnerable, but the government seems willing to accept this vulnerability in exchange for other policy objectives. Nature restoration is important, renewable energy is important, housing is important, but food security is also important, and right now British policy is trading away food security for everything else. In 2025, the UK experienced drought that reduced cereal yields and crop production. The damage was significant. The Environment Agency warned that without a wet winter into 2026, widespread drought could follow. A weather crisis, on top of an economic crisis, could trigger a wave of farm failures. This is the context in which James is making decisions about his farm. He's 58 years old. He's been farming his entire adult life. He would like his farm to continue, but he's a realist. His daughter has a good job in the city. She earns a salary, has benefits, works in an air-conditioned office. Why would she come home to run a farm that loses money every year and will immediately trigger a 6-figure tax bill when he dies? The rational economic decision is clear. Don't inherit the farm. Let it be sold, move on. But that's what's happening across the country. Farmer after farmer is making this same rational economic decision. Approximately 300 acres of productive farmland are lost to urban development and other non-agricultural uses every single week in the UK. At the same time, younger farmers are retiring or leaving the industry because they can't make money. The average age of British farmers is now 59 years old. There aren't enough young farmers entering the industry to replace the ones who are leaving. The agricultural workforce is shrinking. What replaces small family farms? Large industrial agriculture operations run by corporations and financial firms. These operations have economies of scale. They can weather short-term losses because they're diversified. They have access to capital markets to make big investments. They can negotiate better terms with suppliers and customers because they're purchasing or selling massive volumes. They can afford to lobby government effectively. They don't have the same emotional connection to the land that a family farmer has, but they don't need it. They're there to generate returns for their shareholders. This transformation has enormous implications. Industrial agriculture optimizes for efficiency and profit, not for land stewardship or community. Small farms diversify their operations and provide employment to local people. They take care of the land because they're going to pass it to their children. Large industrial operations focus on monoculture, on squeezing every bit of profit from the land, on using whatever means necessary to reduce costs. They employ far fewer people. They contribute less to local communities. The transition from family farms to industrial agriculture is already happening in places like the United States and parts of Europe. It's a one-way process. Once family farms disappear from a region, they don't come back. The infrastructure disappears. The knowledge disappears. The communities built around agriculture disappear. Cities expand into agricultural land. The land becomes too expensive and too fragmented for agricultural production. What was a thriving farming community becomes a suburban sprawl. This is what's about to happen to Britain if current policy and economic trends continue. Not in 100 years, not in 50 years. In 10 to 20 years, British agriculture will look fundamentally different. It will be dominated by large corporate operations. It will produce less food domestically. It will employ far fewer people. It will be more vulnerable to supply chain disruptions and geopolitical instability. It will be more dependent on imported food. And communities that have been built around agriculture for centuries will cease to exist. Let's think about what this means for food prices and food security in Britain. Right now, there's a disconnect between what farmers receive for their products and what consumers pay. A loaf of bread costs significantly more than the wheat that goes into it. A carton of milk costs much more than the value of milk farmers receive. Most of that price markup goes to processing, packaging, transport, retail markup, and profit margins for companies in those sectors. Farmers get the smallest slice. When farms begin to fail in large numbers, food production doesn't just decline numerically. It declines and becomes more expensive. Corporate agricultural operations have higher overhead costs. They have shareholders who expect returns. They have to finance large capital expenditures. They can't operate on the margins that family farms could survive on. So food prices will rise. The people who suffer most from higher food prices are the people with the least money, the poor, the working class, families struggling to afford groceries. This is the long-term consequence of the collapse of British farming. Food becomes more expensive and less secure. The ability of Britain to feed itself declines. The country becomes more dependent on other nations for basic nutrition. That's a dangerous position to be in. Supply chains are fragile. Trade relationships shift. Geopolitical tensions rise. A nation that can't feed itself is a nation that's vulnerable. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to James and to what's happening right now in 2026. James is facing multiple crises simultaneously. His milk prices are down. His input costs are up. His profit margins have disappeared. Government support is uncertain. And in April, a new tax is about to take effect that will immediately create a liability when he eventually retires or passes the farm on. He's applied for government support through various schemes, but the rules keep changing. The Sustainable Farming Initiative was cut off in 2025. The basic payment scheme has been reduced significantly. A farmer who was receiving substantial government support suddenly finds that support eliminated or drastically reduced. How is he supposed to adjust to that? He's already operating at a loss. The government support was what made the difference between breaking even and running at a deficit. Without it, the math simply doesn't work. James has done the calculations. He's a good businessman. He keeps detailed records. He knows his costs down to the penny. And the conclusion is inescapable. His farm is not economically viable at current prices and current input costs. Something has to change. Either prices have to rise significantly, or input costs have to fall dramatically, or government support has to increase substantially, or he has to fundamentally restructure his farm to operate differently. But restructuring takes capital. He doesn't have capital. He's been running at a loss. So what does he do? A lot of farmers in his situation are selling land. They're selling equipment. They're taking out loans. They're deferring necessary maintenance and repairs. They're cutting corners on safety and best practices because they literally can't afford to do things properly. These are desperate measures by desperate people. But desperation doesn't change the fundamental economics. Selling land reduces the productive capacity of the farm, making the business less viable. Selling equipment means he can't operate efficiently when prices recover. Taking out loans just creates debt obligations that further reduce profitability. Other farmers are considering leaving the industry entirely. They're looking at what their land could sell for and thinking about taking that money and retiring or switching careers. A 58-year-old farmer with a farm worth over £1 million could sell it, pay off any debts, and have substantial capital to live on. That's increasingly looking like the rational choice. Better to get out while you can, convert the land value to cash, and move on to something more stable. But here's what's tragic about this. These farmers don't want to leave. Farming is their identity. It's their heritage. It's what they've spent their entire lives doing. They want to pass on the farm to their children. They want their grandchildren to farm the same land. But the economic reality is forcing them out. The market doesn't care about heritage. The market doesn't care about legacy. The market only cares about price, cost, and profit. And by those metrics, small family farms in Britain are no longer viable. The government could reverse this. They could remove the inheritance tax changes. They could increase support for farmers. They could implement strict regulations preventing corporate consolidation of agricultural land. They could ensure that farmers receive a fair price for their products. They could invest in agricultural infrastructure and technology to help farms become more productive and efficient. They could do any number of things to preserve British farming. But they're not doing those things. Instead, they're moving in the opposite direction. The 2026 inheritance tax change is proceeding. Government support remains uncertain. Policies increasingly prioritize other land uses over food production. And the profitability crisis in agriculture continues to deepen. This combination of factors creates a situation where the collapse of British farming isn't a possibility. It's a certainty. The timeline is compressed. What might have taken decades is happening in years. Justin Rogers said it plainly. If we don't do something this time, British agriculture will be over in 2 generations maximum. Most people don't grasp the enormity of what he's saying. He's not saying farming will be harder. He's not saying some farmers will leave the industry. He's saying British agriculture as we know it will effectively cease to exist. The family farms that have been the backbone of the industry will be gone. The knowledge will be gone. The rural communities will be transformed, and the country will become dependent on imported food from other nations. James understands this. Farmers across Britain understand this. That's why they've taken to the streets. That's why they've organized protests. That's why they're demanding that politicians listen and act. They're not protesting because they want special treatment. They're protesting because they're facing extinction. And extinction isn't a dramatic metaphor for farmers. It's literal. Their farms will cease to exist. Their way of life will end. Their legacy will be sold off or abandoned. The story of James and thousands of farmers like him is the story of Britain's food future. It's a story of rational economic forces destroying an industry. It's a story of policy mistakes compounding on market failures. It's a story of a nation trading away its agricultural base for other policy objectives. And it's a story that most of Britain still doesn't understand. By 2050, when the cumulative effects of these trends become undeniable, it will be too late to reverse. The farms will be gone. The farmland will have been repurposed. The knowledge will have been lost. The supply chains will be structured around imported food. The country will be dependent on other nations for basic nutrition. Food prices will be higher. Food security will be fragile. And there won't be a way to go backward. But we're not at 2050 yet. We're at 2026. There's still time. The agricultural collapse isn't completed. It's accelerating, but it hasn't finished. There's still a possibility of intervention. There's still a chance to reverse the inheritance tax changes, increase support for farmers, and protect British agriculture. But that possibility is closing. Every month that passes, more farmers leave. Every quarter that passes, more land is sold. Every year that passes, the trend becomes more entrenched. James is one farmer. He faces an impossible situation. But he's representative of a much larger crisis. He's representative of the systematic dismantling of British agriculture. He's representative of a nation that's losing its capacity to feed itself. And unless something changes, unless the government and society recognize what's happening and act to prevent it, his story will be repeated thousands of times over the next 5 to 10 years. The final generation of British farmers will leave the land. The agricultural legacy will end, and Britain will have to confront a food future it's not prepared for. That's the story of why British farmers are being wiped out in 2 generations. It's not a single catastrophe. It's a convergence of economic forces, policy failures, and market dynamics. It's a tragedy that's playing out in real time, and most Britain isn't even aware it's happening.